Okay, so hi everyone, my name's Beth. I'm the community support worker here at Lancashire LGBT, and welcome to Lancashire LGBT's Mental Health Hour. This is our 8th episode of the Mental Health Hour, and we're really excited today to have Tamsin Nicole from Tamsin Nicole Yoga with us. Just a little bit about Lancashire LGBT for those who don't know. We are a pan-Lancashire charity, helping people in Lancashire on the LGBTQIA+ spectrum feeling happier, healthier and well connected. And this LGBT Mental Health Hour was set up with the intention to open up conversations around mental health, of course, but how that impacts the LGBTQ+ community, and within that, the different intersections, different demographics of people that exist within that community, and how their mental health is experienced by drawing on the expertise of people within the field of mental health who are part of the LGBTQ+ community as well. So we've had various different episodes in the past that are all available on our YouTube channel, and today we're coming with something a little bit more different around the well-being side of mental health. It's about yoga and particular queer yoga practices. So just a little bit of housekeeping, if people in the audience can keep their microphones off, and it'll just be myself, the guest speaker Tamsin, and of course our BSL interpreter Craig, who will have our videos on. So a little bit of an audio description as well of myself. I've got a white background behind me, and there's logos either side of me that say Lancashire LGBT, and the LGBT is in different colours. I've got long brown dark curly hair, I've got white skin, I've got red spectacles on that have got a little glasses chain attached to them, and I'm wearing a denim jumpsuit that's got a collar. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to introduce our wonderful guest for today. Hello, Tamsin. I'm going to give you a little bit of an introduction first. So Tamsin is a yoga instructor who actually trained in Lancashire, in Preston, and she specialises in teaching yoga for marginalised bodies, such as, but not limited to, queer people and people of colour communities. They also have a professional background in LGBTQIA+ domestic abuse and mental health support work. They recently held a highly successful day retreat for people of colour in Manchester called Soft Life, which I know that she's going to speak more about. And it was actually the first of its kind in the region. And they also teach weekly queer yoga classes in Manchester, as well as educating people online through her social media page, which is at Tamsin Nicole Yoga on Instagram. And we'll put that in the description as well. So, hi, Tamsin.
Hello, thank you for that amazing intro.
Of course, thank you so much for being here and sharing your wisdom with us. I'm really excited for this discussion. So just to kick it off, really, I just wanted to ask you, what kind of personally inspired you to get into teaching yoga, to get into teaching queer inclusive yoga specifically with your kind of life journey?
Yeah, the reason I took the step into teaching was because I've practiced yoga for years, but I always felt like I would have loved to have gone to like a queer centered class, or I would love to have gone that was like a POC centered class. And I kind of just thought, well, why not create it? It's kind of like that, you know, be the change that you wish to see, all of that. So that's the main reason I started my training. Just because I really needed the space myself, and I knew that there would be other people who were practicing yoga or were thinking about practicing yoga but thought that maybe it wasn't for them because these spaces didn't exist. I thought, okay, well, let's do this. And also mainly out of just trying to create a safe space as well. I know that word gets thrown around, but just in the sense of like homophobia, transphobia is still a thing everywhere, and it will exist in yoga studios and yoga spaces. You know, those places aren't, you know, free from it. So we deserve to have a space where we can go and experience these practices because they're amazing and they do offer a lot of peace, a lot of joy, a lot of love, a lot of calm that queer people deserve, and people of colour deserve, and anyone else who is a marginalised person deserves. So yeah, we shouldn't really be cut off from those things. And I think as well, that goes hand in hand with the fact that yoga can be really therapeutic. It can help you kind of work through anything you're dealing with your mental health, any kind of trauma, that kind of stuff, it can be kind of like an add-on to therapy and stuff. But if you're going to go to a space where you don't feel safe, it kind of adds on to that as well. So it's kind of like twofold, threefold, whatever. So you don't want to be going somewhere to try and heal and then deal with further trauma. So again, that's why we need these spaces, because right now queer people are crying out for healing and crying out for these things. So we deserve to have those spaces. And also I think like we deserve to have queer spaces that aren't just, oh, let's go out and get really drunk, or let's go to Canal Street, let's do that. I know you talk about this a lot. You do a lot of work on this. And why not have a queer space that is solely focused on our healing, on our wellness, on our self-care? Because for me, that is a huge, huge part of activism. I'm going to sit here, I'm going to meditate, I'm going to do yoga, I'm going to look after myself, whilst you're all wanting me to feel shame. I feel like that is a massive message to say, actually, I want to connect to my true self no matter what you say. So yeah, that's another part of it as well. Wow. And then I think that all kind of comes under this idea of, when we're talking about activism as well, we can't, social, political movements are necessary. They, I'm not advocating against those. They are necessary and needed. But I feel like we can only get to a certain level with that, and we need to have deep collective healing to move ourselves forward. And that's not just for queer people, not just for people of colour, that is for everyone in all of society. In order for us to actually move forward and see each other and hear each other, we have to heal, because we're all walking around with this trauma. We're all walking around with, whether that's something that we've experienced personally, or whether it's intergenerational, whether it's stuff from the past, we're all walking around in fight or flight. And everyone has to heal that. And yoga is one of the ways that we can make a step towards that. So yeah, that was a very long-winded answer.
That was an amazing answer, Tamsin. That was absolutely superb. Brilliant. I think one of the things I'm hearing from that, particularly when you said about the kind of self-care side of it, like it's like radical self-care, in terms of, like you were saying, people are wanting certain groups of people, like society wants certain groups of people to feel a certain way, shame, discrimination, all this, but by practicing stuff like this, it's kind of radical, really. It is activism, like you say. It's very interesting to look at it in that way. Okay, so I just wanted to ask you now, because obviously I'm aware there's people who are watching who may never have thought about the barriers to yoga before, maybe because they exist in a more privileged body. So what are the main barriers that you've experienced, or you've seen other people experience in yoga settings, in terms of how people can feel unwelcome in those settings?
Yeah, for sure. I think it's important to note there's many different styles of yoga settings. You can go to your gym, you can go to a yoga studio, you can go to the park, you could go so many different places. So there are places where we can go and we can practice yoga and it be really inclusive and really accessible. But when we look at the mainstream of what we see as yoga, we do see cis people, heterosexual people, white, thin-bodied, able-bodied people who have made it into this very physically focused practice, almost like a fitness class, which is absolutely not what yoga is. But then when you look at how it is presented, when you go on Instagram and type in yoga, that's exactly what you see. You're going to think, okay, well, that's not for me then, is it really? That's not something that I really should be getting involved in or can get involved with. So this affects everyone, not just queer people. And there's this, I guess it's turned into this kind of like aesthetic. And when things become an aesthetic, there's this automatic idea of like, okay, well, if I don't fit that aesthetic, there's going to be judgment. There's going to be people there who think, oh, well, you can't wear these leggings, or you can't wear this, or you don't look like me. So there's going to be some level of like comparison there, and it just instantly puts people off. That's where I was when I first started practicing yoga, and it just feels uncomfortable. And then there's also the kind of spiritual side of it, which can kind of, I guess, again, has kind of been rejigged to fit this narrative of when we kind of think about these words that get thrown around like divine masculine and divine feminine that really fit into these like gender stereotypes and patriarchal values, it's just going to be like, nah, that's not for me. This isn't this isn't where I want to go. And that could really feed it, especially the spiritual stuff, that could really feed into, especially when we're talking about queer people, feed into some like really deep trauma based around like religious ideals, or, you know, like being a good man and being a good woman and all this kind of stuff. So it's physical and it's also spiritual, and all of these barriers come into play in so many different ways. And then there's just kind of like the obvious stuff as well. So like people being misgendered when going to a yoga class, people using gendered language, like, okay, this asana, this posture is really good for men, and this one's good for women, or not making an inclusive space in that sense. And then from the get-go, as soon as you come into that space, you're like, okay, well, this isn't for me. So it's kind of like on so many levels, whether it's physical, whether it's spiritual, whether it's just having an inclusive and accessible space for queer people, it's just kind of across the board. So yeah, it's really difficult as well, because when we are talking about yoga, and that's, I've already touched on it as well, is that it is so healing. So the fact that when you break it down like that, it actually makes me feel a little bit like really quite emotional, like thinking about how layered this is, like, and how many barriers there are, and it's not just what you can see on the surface. It goes way much deeper than that. And it I guess it touches on this idea of the way how people like say that yoga has been colonized or it's been culturally appropriate, because this was not always the way. It's a practice that comes from thousands and thousands of years ago. It was for everybody, but then when you see the way it is in the West now, it fits into these systems of oppression so well, or the way it's been co-opted fits in. It is very frustrating. But there are ways that we can tackle this, and that's why I'm here.
Yeah, exactly. And thank you for that. It's so important for people to, because I know that when I first started to practice yoga, and which was many years ago now, like I didn't know any of that. I didn't really understand that it was a sacred practice that had been like co-opted from another part of the world and massively misinterpreted. And with you there mentioning about some of the boundaries, particularly for queer people, just to illustrate one, because it always stands out in my mind, and I remember it so clearly when I was doing some yoga at university, and there was a non-binary person, and they weren't quite out at that point, but the class just got very gendered at one point. Like the instructor was just kind of like, okay, girls here, boys here, and this person was literally just asking like, well, where do I go? Like, so that it's just a very kind of obvious example, but I think, yeah, for trans people as well, for non-binary people, it can be genuine, like you say. It can be sort of traumatic to be there, because then it's like, I've come here for healing, and now I'm just sort of being put into this very uncomfortable situation. I feel like there's a spotlight on me. I feel uncomfortable, I don't feel safe, I don't know who to go to for support in this situation, because if the instructor, who has a duty of care and responsibility, is the one who's perpetrating this gender binary, and it can be so many other things other than gender binaries. But have you seen any of that, like when you've been in classes and stuff like that, when you were teaching, practicing, learning?
Yeah, definitely. I've had in my training actually, where people have kind of like scoffed at the idea of people being non-binary, or kind of noticed people like shifting their seats when I like mention anything to do with being queer and things like that. So there's definitely, and that was really difficult, because I was there to obviously learn from the people who were amazing teachers in so many ways. And this is what's also really difficult, is that like there's a lot of this stuff that is so amazing and it really touches you, and you're like, wow. But then there's this, and then things to do with like patriarchy and homophobia, transphobia just gets lumped on top of it. So then it's like this big mix of like, well, this is nice and I can really hold on to this, but then there's also all of this crap that shouldn't be here. So it's a really kind of like a really hard minefield to go through. And that was me doing my teacher training. So that's me after, practicing yoga for quite a while. So I can't imagine what it feels like now, like going to a class for the first time and hearing that stuff or seeing that stuff. It would just put you off completely. So yeah, I think this is why it's so important that we have these conversations and we have these classes. And I think sometimes people get a little bit confused as to why I want to do this, and it's like I'm the one that's not being inclusive by excluding straight people or white people or whoever from these spaces and making them, like queer yoga, for example, that is for queer people, and I do have that rule, and that is because I want it to be a safe space and I don't want all of this stuff to come on top of it and cloud it. And we're not at that, unfortunately. Ideally we wouldn't need a queer yoga class, we wouldn't need to have these extra classes, but we do right now because mainstream classes aren't inclusive. So we've got a lot of work to do. So that's the tricky bit that comes with highlighting this stuff, is that people sometimes feel that we're trying to make more divide when actually it's just trying to bring more people in.
Yeah. Okay. And before we move on to the next question, maybe it's a good point actually to talk about your soft life retreat. Because I'm aware there was a little bit of pushback from some people about that, but speak to that, but also obviously speak about the positives of the retreat and what it means and how it went and how incredible it is.
Yeah. Of course, yeah. I mean, it was an amazing day. Like, it was, I think, one of the best things I've done, ever. And it just went so smoothly. And it was like one of those things where me and the other facilitators just like looked at each other at the end and was like, we were meant to do this. Like, we were supported through this by somebody somewhere, whatever you want to call it. Like, this was like meant to happen. And yeah, it was just like a room of 40 people who came together just to celebrate us, celebrate joy, celebrate our happiness. And also, I think one of the things that, can you hear me? Went off. Oh no. One of the things that one of the other facilitators said at the start, which I think kind of explains it really nicely about why we did it. She spoke about our ancestors and how they may not have been able to have a soft life and have the life that they deserve. So this was us kind of honouring them and moving forward into a soft life as out of respect for them and out of love for them, which I thought was so beautiful and really, really touched, I think, everyone in the room by her saying that. So yeah, that kind of just explains it for me as well, in a sense that, like, we deserve to have some peace in a world that doesn't allow us to have much peace. We deserve to have a soft life. And I know it's kind of like a phrase that gets thrown about a lot, but I like it. I think, we do deserve to have some softness. We don't always have to be strong. We don't always have to be fighting. We don't always have to be, advocating for ourselves. Sometimes it's nice to just chill out. And that's what we were kind of, and again, it's that self-care as activism, isn't it? It's we're saying, actually, we value our bodies, we value our minds, we value our souls, and we are worthy of everything. So yeah, and I think talking about the pushback, it was just a few, Facebook trolls who had some things to say about how it was like excluding people and stuff. And I think it just comes from lack of education, lack of understanding. And I think if we were able to have a conversation with them, maybe they would have got it a little bit more if we could explain why we were doing it. But then sometimes people kind of want an argument, don't they? So it could have been either or. But
I mean, that's social media, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So we didn't really let it get to us too much because it was on social media, and we had an amazing day. And every single person that I've spoken to anyway, and everyone that I've got feedback off, had an amazing day and kind of said it was almost really a day of deep healing for them. They didn't realize how much they needed it until they were there, until they kind of went through it and had that experience and then came away from it. Someone told me that after the retreat, they went home and slept until the next day, straight away. It finished for, and they just went and slept, and then the next day they woke up and just felt like a new human. And I was like, wow.
It's like they've been given permission to relax.
Yeah, to relax. And they said that they felt that they'd never actually relaxed before. Like that they up until that point they didn't they thought that they'd relax, they thought that they'd felt peace, but it wasn't until that moment that they realized, actually, I've been stressed this whole time.
Yeah.
And that is just so powerful to hear, and it just shows the power of these practices as well.
Yes.
And how they're meant to do, you're meant to do yoga as a community, right? They're meant to connect us all. It's meant to show that, it's meant to get rid of all of that stuff that you've been told about yourself, all that fakeness, all that anxiety, all of that, you know, anything that's no use to you, and connect you to your true self, but then also connect you to the person next to you, and bring us all together. So to be able to do that in a room where everyone knew on a level that we'd all experienced some level of racism, we've all experienced some level of discrimination, we all had that kind of like understanding, but it wasn't about that at the same time. We weren't all sat there, you know, holding hands and crying about racism. We were uplifting each other and celebrating us, and I guess just being together in joy, which we should be able to do. It's nothing more than that. That's why I was like, what should I say? I was like, no, it was just,
no, that's it.
Yeah.
Wow, that's amazing. That's amazing.
Yeah.
And we will put, like, obviously your details, but you know, about Soft Life into the description as well, because it's based in Manchester, but people from other places can come, can't they, to the retreats if they want to?
Yeah. Obviously Manchester, but we had people come from like Liverpool and Leeds and stuff. So
great.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Which kind of links to the next question, which is kind of, with all these problems, these barriers that you've very well articulated that still exist in yoga spaces, what kind of is being done to make the spaces more inclusive, or what should be done more of in the future to make yoga spaces more inclusive?
Yeah, in terms of what's being done, from what I can see, is I do think people are kind of understanding that more needs to be done. They get it. We can talk about it, we can have a conversation. And I do see that there's, you know, other classes cropping up around Manchester and things that are for queer people and trans people. But I do think that there is a lot more that needs to be done. When you go to a kind of mainstream class, there's nothing that says that this is a space for queer people. You know, there's most of the time it's, and you know, it doesn't necessarily have to be anything like extravagant or specific, but I think sometimes, kind of like what we mentioned in terms of the barriers, so discussing the divine feminine, divine masculine, knowing where that comes from and understanding what context are you talking about that. Are you reinforcing gender roles? Are you reinforcing patriarchy? Or are you talking about it in terms of energy? Are you giving some kind of background knowledge, or are you just putting it out there and placing, oh, you look like a woman, so the divine feminine's for you kind of thing? And I guess that comes down to, I think a lot of yoga teachers and yoga studios really need to, there's this thing an element of the 8 limbs of yoga called Svadhyaya, which is self-study. And I think the more that yoga teachers tap into this and really think about their own biases and think about how am I showing up at my class? Who if a group of queer people came to my class, would I feel uncomfortable? How would I respond to that? And then moving forward from that, educating yourself, developing an understanding, reaching out to queer organizations, queer charities, and you know, maybe offering yoga practices, maybe offering meditation practices, and then just doing the simple stuff like stating your pronouns at the start of class. Like that could really make someone in there think, okay, well, this is a safe space for me. This person gets it. This person has read some stuff and knows that they need, you know, it makes me feel comfortable if their pronouns are stated as well. And you know, not using that gendered language when talking about particular asanas or postures, and knowing the reason why you're not using those as well. I think, you know, some people might see this or listen to this or read something and think, okay, I can't use gendered language, but then not understand why.
Yeah. And then it's just like,
Yeah.
you're just reciting things
Yeah.
or regurgitating things. There's the intention isn't there, is
Yeah.
it? So was that at all part of your yoga teacher training? Was there any stuff around how to interact with queer
No.
people who are doing yoga and stuff, or not?
Yeah, no, that was never really spoken about. My teacher training was quite gendered. There was some things where I kind of picked upon and was like, oh, I don't really like that. And there were some discussions, there were some good discussions that came up, but it wasn't necessarily a part of the training. And I think that is something that is really, really necessary, is if you want to be inclusive, you need to put in the effort and do the training or speak to queer people and really gain an understanding. And then that links into what I was going to say around, I think all yoga teachers need to have an understanding of trauma, and that works for everybody, that not just for queer people, not just for trans people. Every single person coming into your yoga studio, there is a chance that they have experienced something, and you know, they could be triggered by anything, you know, and there's no way in preventing that, you know, 100% preventing that, but there is ways that you can reduce the chance of that happening.
Yeah.
And I think one major step that people can take into being inclusive of queer people to people of colour is being trauma informed. And there's loads of trainings out there. And there's some people that kind of think, oh, well, I'm not really bothered about knowing about trauma. I'm just a yoga teacher, I don't need to know. But when we learn about the body, and I guess it is a part of our training that we do learn that trauma is stored in the body. So as body workers, as people who are instructing people into how, you know, go into this shape or do this breath practice, or, you know, I'll guide you through this sort of meditation, we are going to be tapping into some of those energies and maybe releasing some traumas, and we need to have an understanding of that. And the likelihood of that happening increases when it's a queer person, when it's a person of colour, because we have experienced more trauma. So that is kind of like one of the main things that I would say, is going out there and finding some training into how to make your class more understanding and more inclusive. And then again, just constantly having that self-study, you know, not just doing that training and being like, okay, yeah, that's fine now, I'm great, I don't need to do anymore. Tick box kind of thing. It's you know, like yoga is, it's a lifelong thing, it's a lifelong study, it's a lifelong journey. So making that a part of your yoga practice. Yoga is social justice, right? Yoga is all of these things. Ahimsa, non-violence. Make it a part of your yoga practice to be an inclusive yoga teacher. It's a part of the philosophy. So yeah, I hope that answers the question.
Oh, it more than answers it. Something that I just want to ask you, actually, based on some of the things that you've said there, I think it'd be useful for people who don't understand or haven't come across it before. When you were mentioning about the divine feminine and the divine masculine, and there's a little bit of, sometimes that's problematized in the way that it's explained in yoga settings. Maybe if you could just explain it to us, if that's okay.
Yeah, I mean, I don't claim to be an expert on these particular entities. I just wanted to bring it up because I've noticed that it is a thing that is quite often spoke about in yoga spaces. And I'm not sitting here and saying that shouldn't be spoke about, but what I have noticed is that it can often be kind of put into this patriarchal mindset of like, okay, well, this is for women and this is for men. And these ideals are feminine and these ideals are masculine. And that can obviously make quite a lot of people feel excluded from the conversation. And I think it's just around, when I kind of brought that up as like, I guess like a critique, it was just to kind of, rather than just put it out there and people thinking, well, what does that mean? Let's take it back to what it actually means. It's around the energies that everyone has within inside of them, whether you want to call it that, whether you want to call it the yin and the yang, whether you want to call it the lunar and solar energies, whether you want to call it this, it's and we have multiple energies around us, not just those ones.
Right.
But I feel like a lot of the time these ones are kind of put on the spotlight, and I think that's because we do live in a very binary society, so we like to grasp onto these things, right? So it's just these patriarchal ideas reinforced, and that's why I brought it up as a critique, because it's a lot more than that. It's a lot more than what we're seeing on the surface. So, you know, you see these workshops that are around divine feminine, but then there'll also be mention of working with, and that to me just shouldn't really go together, because I feel like divine feminine could be with anyone in the world, not just people with wombs and that kind of stuff. So it's bringing it into, it's excluding quite a lot of people when we're doing that. So yeah, I don't claim to be like an expert, and I don't want people to think that I'm coming on here and being like, we shouldn't talk about these things, because again, these are things that have been spoken about for thousands of years. I've just noticed that they've kind of been taken and again rejigged into something that they never were. So yeah,
and almost weaponized, arguably.
Yes.
Even if the intention isn't to do that, it might just be unintentional. So these kind of these energies that are like masculine and feminine, basically anyone can have both, basically.
We basically talk about this in queer culture, right? Masc femme, butch femme, do you know what I mean? And like obviously that's how, like, you know, that's gender expression and stuff, but we acknowledge that these things exist, these two dualities exist in the queer world.
Yes.
So it's just but it's the divine feminine and divine masculine has in some spiritual settings, not all, but I've noticed that it's becoming very kind of almost regimented, and it's kind of reminding me of like almost very like religious ideals that are very kind of like, well, these are rules, and this is only for women and this is only for men kind of stuff, which again can make people feel really, really put off and scared by the very thought of it.
Absolutely. No, thank you for explaining that. I'm sure people watching will find that really useful. Okay, so now I just want to move on to mental health, more types of mental health stuff, even though this is all like kind of under the banner of mental health, isn't it? But how can, you know, yoga and I suppose meditation as well help your mental health, particularly as a queer person, particularly as a queer person of colour, maybe drawing on some experiences that you've had personally of how it's helped your mental health?
Yeah, I mean, yoga is, you know, so for me anyway, on my kind of healing journey, my journey with my mental health, it has been the one main thing that has supported me throughout this. It has really been my crutch, especially throughout the pandemic, when it kind of felt like the world was falling apart, even now, you know, but it really, really did kind of support me through that. And I just kind of want to touch on a little bit of yoga philosophy. So in the Yoga Sutras, Yoga Sutra 1.2 states that yoga is the stilling of the fluctuations of the mind. So it's basically, that's like at the start of, you open the Yoga Sutras, that's what you read. That answers the question, right? It is about calming this mind chatter, this anxiety, these fears, this, you know, low mood, this depression. It's around clearing that away and connecting to you, your soul, your true self. So it's kind of the essence of yoga, is supporting your mental health. And that's basically what it's helped me do. It's really, you know, when I'm feeling anxious, whether it's, you know, getting on my mat and doing some movement, whether it's connecting to the breath, whether it's going into meditation, whatever I'm feeling that day, I know that there's something that could either energize me and lift me up if I'm feeling down, or could ground me if I'm feeling kind of all over the show. And I feel like the more I use yoga to take time to connect to me, to connect to my true self, so getting rid of all of that mind chatter, getting rid of all of that, you know, it could be something that someone said to me a few years ago that has stayed with me, and I think that that's my character, or something that's happened to me in my past and that's affected me. The more I strip that back and take it away and get to my true self and practice that on my mat, the more I can show up as me. And then when those things happen again, whether it's, looking at those comments online about the yoga retreat or anything like that, I can just think, well, no, because I know me, I've got me. And it's almost like it strips those back, but then it also acts as almost like a protective factor as well, because I know that I can always go back to my mat, and that's something that no one could ever take away from me. So it's having that place of stillness. And when you are out in the world and it's chaotic and it can get a bit scary, you know that you can always go back to that stillness, and it's always going to be there for you. And that's the one thing, the main thing that has helped me in terms of my mental health, is that even when things get really scary or things get, I can always come back to that. It's like it's a support. And then when we talk about kind of like trauma as well, I've kind of already touched on this in terms of having a trauma-informed practice, but there's a lot of work on this out there where it has really kind of supported people on their healing journeys through trauma. And there's a lot of practitioners, mental health practitioners, that are now using yoga in therapy sessions. They're using connecting to the breath. They're using let's stand up and move our body. Let's sit here and just put our arms up and just notice how that feels. Because there's this now shift happening as people, I guess, learn more about trauma. They understand that it is stored in the body. And we're all walking around with all of this tension, all of this holding, and there's no amount of speaking, there's no amount of talking and trying to work out the mind that will get rid of that. So it's almost like having more of like a bottom-up approach now. It's like, let's get this all out, and then you can try and make sense of it in your head, kind of stuff. So yeah, that's
It's interesting that was, yoga was once considered more of like a holistic thing, and therefore in, I suppose, the Western view of medicine and mental health support, lesser than. But you're right, like nowadays it's becoming a lot more the norm to seeing that mind-body connection and seeing the power of these practices, which is really interesting.
Yeah, there's a lot of, when reading kind of yoga philosophy and stuff, you can really see the connection with some therapeutic processes, like when you think about like CBT and stuff, like still in the fluctuations of the mind and all that kind of stuff, really connects with that like CBT approach to therapy. And when I did my trauma-informed training, the person that was running that was doing yoga on the NHS now. So it is really something that is, being seen for what it is. And also I think it's really important though that we don't kind of like step away from the fact that it is yoga, because I think sometimes it can be like, oh well, this is mindfulness and this is breath work and this is, but actually these things have been around for thousands of years, and we have to be respectful of that, and we have to know that, almost be, we have to be grateful that we do have these things, and these gurus from thousands of years have allowed us to have this knowledge, and not just now say, oh well, actually it's medical now, it's the NHS has said it, okay, so I'm going to use it. Well, actually it's still yoga. Do you know what I mean? Let's not now continue this idea that, oh, because it's now medical it's better and it's okay. It's still yoga, right? Now it's got a seal of approval. I suppose like the other danger, which I know that like you speak a lot about as well, is the kind of commodification and massive commercialization of yoga, of the well-being industry for what it is now. And I think that probably yoga was the main thing that started that off, in terms of westernized versions of yoga and people making a lot of money out of that. How do you feel about that as a practitioner? It is frustrating, and I think obviously yoga teachers should be paid because we are offering a service, and it takes a lot of work, it takes a lot of effort, it takes a lot of training, so you should be paid for that, because we live in a capitalist society and that's how the world goes. but I do think this idea of like creating a yoga business and kind of creating like a monopoly on it, and it being around making money rather than the practice. I think in the Queer Dharma, which is the just like a reference point, Queer Dharma, if anyone wants to read it, please do. It's an amazing book. I think it mentioned in there, like, let the practice be led by the practice. And that was something that really stuck with me, is that always, it's really easy in this world, especially when, you know, we've got social media and we've got all of these pressures, and you know, we're all skin, to let your mindset be skewed, and to go towards, oh well, I need to make money, or oh I need this many things, and I need this, and thinking about building, when actually bring it back to the practice, bring it back to what the 8 limbs of yoga say, bring it back to that philosophy, bring it back to why you're doing this, and what the sole purpose is, and not let it, all of these other things that can be quite toxic, lead you astray. So that's something that I think a lot of people could take on board when because I think most people, I hope that most people that begin teaching yoga do it with good intentions, but I do think that it comes from Instagram and all this other stuff that makes people feel like they have to be, you know, charging this much for a retreat or making this much money. So it's a difficult one, because you don't want people to not get paid, but you also don't want that to be the sole reason that people are teaching yoga.
Finding that balance. Okay, so I'm aware we went a little bit off piece there, but the last question I want to come to before we come to the audience question is kind of any guidance that you have, Tamsin, for, you know, queer or other people who exist in marginalised bodies that are maybe, you know, struggling with their mental health and they want to get into yoga, but they just don't know how to. What would be your guidance there?
I would say, to start off with, find, you know, a YouTube video or something online that's free, so you're not, you know, having to pay any money when you're unsure about it, and just see how it goes. Don't put too much pressure on yourself for it to be amazing, you know, and have this spiritual awakening the first time round, or to feel perfectly, you know, amazing after your first session. Just see how it goes. Find something that you feel comfortable doing, something that's accessible for you. There's so many things out there online that you can access, and just take it day by day, whether it's, you know, doing the physical practice, doing the asana practice, or whether it's, you know, doing the breath work, the pranayama, or the guided meditations, and just take it day by day and do what feels right for you. If you're feeling like, oh well, the movement stuff isn't really me right now, try some breath work. That is still yoga. And I think that's also a really important point, is that we have in the West only really focused on the physical side of yoga, which is only one part of it. There's 8 limbs of yoga, and that's just one of them. So there's so much out there that you could be doing other than that physical side. Find what you could do is also find some books that you could read to build your knowledge on it before even buying a yoga mat. Do you know what I mean? Before even going out there to a class. That book, The Queer Dharma, taught me more about yoga and spiritual practice than until I read that book. I feel like that really opened my eyes to a whole other world. So finding that I guess teacher that you can follow really helps. And yeah, just also having fun with it. I think sometimes this stuff can get really serious and can feel really like, I must be healing, I must be doing these things, and then that becomes a chore in itself, and it's kind of like that kind of like takes away from your self-care. And remember that you're still allowed to have a nice time, and if some days you don't want to do yoga, you don't have to do yoga. Like it's all right. And I know we talk about consistency, and that is important, but some days we're not up for it, and just be being patient with yourself and be kind to yourself, and yeah, like I say, have fun. It's not all serious.
Absolutely. And if anyone wants to find your classes specifically, if you want to just sort of tell us what they are now, like I said, we'll put them in the description. I know they're Manchester, but for some people in Lancashire, that's not that far away.
Yeah. So I teach on a Thursday at a place called Milk and Honey in Manchester on Oxford Road. Thursday at 4:15. It's £5 per person. If you follow me on Instagram, which is Tamsin Nicole Yoga, you will find all the information about that class. I also do a yoga brunch on the last Sunday of every month, where you get a yoga class and some food after, and it's really nice because we keep the group quite small, so everyone kind of like gets to know each other and stuff, which is really cute. And then I also teach a class in Eccles on a Wednesday evening, 6 till 7, which is a slow flow class. So yeah, that's where you can find me.
And the slow flow class even is really good for beginners, isn't it?
Yeah. So it's you kind of slow the practice down. It can still be a little bit of a challenge because we hold each asana for like 6 breaths, so you are holding your body in a shape for some time, but as always in all of my classes, everything is optional. You can always take a break. So it's a good class to kind of get to know each asana as well, because sometimes with like vinyasa you're kind of moving through